Welcome, and thank you for joining us today for our 2018 webinar, Round 2, Art and Accessibility Without Assumptions. I'm Sherilyn Seeley, Program Manager for Grantmakers in the Arts. Grantmakers in the Arts is a national membership association of public and private arts and culture funders. Our mission is to provide leadership and service that advances the use of philanthropic and governmental resources to support the growth of art and culture. In mainstream culture, there are communities and identity groups who are overlooked, devalued, and passively dismissed. As we move towards a more inclusive and equitable culture, it is critical that we evaluate our understanding of how to be more welcoming, inclusive, and equitable. Last year, we talked about the history of accessibility in the United States, types of accessibility, and the Americans with Disabilities Act. This year, we brought back Ann Mulgrave, Manager of Grants and Accessibility at Greater Pittsburgh Arts Council. Presenting alongside her, we have Leah Krauss, Senior Program Officer for Dance and Special Projects at Mertz Gilmore Foundation, and Leah's special guest, Alice Sheppard, Disabled Choreographer and Dancer. They will discuss welcoming people with disabilities and funding disability arts projects. Leah Krauss joined Mertz Gilmore Foundation in 2009 and is currently the Senior Program Officer for Dance and Special Projects. The dance program provides operating support for contemporary dance presenters located throughout the 5 boroughs and makes discrete investments to advance the dance field by improving conditions for individual artists. In addition, Krauss is an advisory board member for Dance NYC and was co-chair of New York Grantmakers in the Arts during 2016 and 2017. And Mulgrave joined Greater Pittsburgh Arts Council as Manager of Grants and Accessibility in November of 2012. Prior to joining the GPAC staff, Mulgrave was the program officer at FISA Foundation, where she managed the foundation's regional initiative to increase accessibility to the arts for people with disabilities. A longtime advocate for people with disabilities, Mulgrave brings her strong ties to the disability community, acting as a bridge connecting people with disabilities to the arts. We're glad to have them present on this webinar. At the very end of the presentation, I will be joining to facilitate a Q&A. And with that, I will turn it over to our presenters. Welcome, Leah, Ann, and Alice. Ann, why don't you kick us off?
Hi, and thank you all for taking a break from the Kavanaugh hearings to learn about arts and accessibility. Since 2012, I have been leading GPAC's Access to the Arts Initiative. In that capacity, I've worked with organizations of all sizes and disciplines, as well as individual artists, on how to welcome people with disabilities. Now, one of the most important things about accessibility is to keep in mind that the ADA is actually a civil rights law. On the screen in front of us are 2 images. The one on the right is a black and white photograph showing activists in the 1970s who have mobility limitations literally hauling themselves up the steps outside the U.S. Capitol building to protest the inaccessibility of government. On the left-hand side is a poster from the same 1970s disability rights movement, and it has ADAPT, and there is a silhouette image in red on it of a person in a wheelchair with their left arm raised in a fist salute, and on the t-shirt it says, "Free our people." Now, my connection to this is deep. My parents led the disability rights movement in Western Pennsylvania because when my brother was born in 1967 with Down syndrome, the doctors told my mother to put him in an institution and forget him. My mother said no because she's my mother. And my father formed organizations and inspected those same institutions with other groups of parents. When they inspected those institutions, they found people living in cages. They found people choking to death on inedible meat, and they closed them. My father then formed an organization that provided community housing. So this actual civil rights movement at that time was a matter of life and death, and it remains that way today. The anthem of the disability rights movement has always been, "Nothing about us without us," which means if you want to be more accessible, talk to people with disabilities. Now that means, why should you listen to me? Well, I am a person with 2 non-obvious disabilities. I am dyslexic and I have attention deficit disorder. What does that mean? That means that I depend on medication to treat the ADD and limit the impact of dyslexia. without that medication, it would actually be difficult for me to maintain employment. These two disabilities not just impact how I perceive the world, but also how the world perceives me because of the way that those disabilities manifest. Now, the other thing that you want to realize about accessibility, especially for grant makers, is that accessibility is about equity. It is not about compliance. The ADA is a civil rights law, but it manifests itself not as a building code, but as customer service, which is crucial because what the ADA encourages you to do, and what I encourage you to do is actually go beyond this, is to meet people where they are. And it's mission-driven. If you look at all of your individual missions, I am guessing that they say we want to serve everybody. They don't say we want to serve everybody except people with disabilities. So I am guessing that actually serving people with disabilities is part of your mission. The issue with achieving that mission is about realizing that there are barriers that you probably don't even realize are there that are preventing people with disabilities from engaging with you as a grant maker. As a result, that's what we're going to focus on today. The NEA has 5 key requirements for arts access. 3 of them we're not going to focus on too much today, and the 3 we're not focusing on are do not discriminate against individuals with disabilities, remove barriers to existing facilities and new construction, and provide individuals with equal employment opportunities. Those are big things to deal with. So the way to start with this process is to provide effective communication mechanisms and equal opportunities. We are going to talk about that today. And to review and modify policies, procedures, and practices to prevent discrimination. Now, I have 20 minutes, and we're going to cover a lot, so I'm going to speed up from this point on. Under the ADA, effective communication means that whatever is written or spoken must be as clear and understandable to people with disabilities as it is for people who do not have disabilities. This means that the contents of your communication, written materials, websites, social media, must be understandable to people who are blind, or people who are deaf, or people like me who are dyslexic. Now, this also includes online access. During the Obama administration, the most likely way for public accommodations, like universities or even grant makers or anyone, to be sued was because they were not providing effective communication in online access. That is now under question under the current presidential administration. However, since President Trump has taken office, even though the Justice Department has not filed as many enforcement actions, the number of people who are being sued over lack of accessibility has gone up substantially. So where the government has stepped back, private individuals have stepped forward. And I want you to keep that in mind as we go forward. Okay. Now, the other thing we're talking about is what we refer to as programmatic access. And what that is, and it sounds like the same language, but it's 2 different things, is it requires the content of any program be available to everyone in the most integrated setting possible. What that's referring to is providing programmatic accommodations, which means American Sign Language interpretation for people who are deaf, audio description for people who are blind, or providing written materials in alternative forms for people like Braille programming, electronic online access, or podcasts, things like that, electronic documents that people can read with screen readers. Now, you can require advance notice from people requesting accommodations. That's where most people come in with like a 2-week policy, and the accommodations cannot place an undue burden on your organization. What undue burden means is something completely different for everyone. My experience as being both an accessibility person and a grant maker is that accessible grant making equals welcoming communication. What welcoming communication means is that you are sending a signal that you get it, that you understand what people with disabilities need, and that they don't have to educate you or fight with you to be able to fully participate within your programming. Now, welcoming communication is not just about how you communicate, but it includes what information you share with people. This requires empathy. All right? Now, I am going to tell you a story that's going to illustrate what I mean by this. This slide now has a photograph on it. On the photograph, I am standing in the background introducing a speaker. The speaker is a woman by the name of Elaine. At the time she was speaking and presenting for one of our seminars, she was a PhD candidate at the Human Engineering Research Laboratory, which goes by the unfortunate acronym of HURL at the University of Pittsburgh. And she was coming to talk to us about accessible events. Now, she's sitting in a very whizzy, fancy wheelchair that has raised her up to the height I am. I'm about 5'6". Her head is about level to me. It's a very fancy wheelchair. And what Elaine talked about was the process she goes through when she goes to an event at a new location. Her first step is to basically go on to Google Street View and take a look at the door of the organization, of the location that she's going to visit. Now, this slide shows the GPAC office door on Google Street View. On the sort of lower right-hand corner of it, you'll see a sign that says Tusk. That's our landlord. Underneath that, you will see a button, a power button for a door. And then you can see our door. And it looks like a really big door with 2 handles. It looks like a great double door. It's actually not. It's a large single door that's split in half, and only one side opens with the button. But what Elaine's going to do is she's going to look at that and she's going to say, okay, I can get in that door or I can't. That's great information. But what that view doesn't show her is what happens when she gets in there. Our offices are on the 6th floor. Our event space is on the 7th floor. Okay, so this is what she encounters when she comes in. There's our elevators. This is an old building, 1800s or so. You can see our elevator, and my program associate, Shaki Scott, standing in it to give you an idea of scale. You can fit 4 people in there in a very awkward silence where everybody's holding in their stomach. So it's small, big wheelchair, kind of hard. If you are someone who has a visual impairment and you're going to go look at the buttons in that elevator, which are on the right-hand side of this image, you will see the buttons for 8, 7, and 6. Besides 7 and 6, there's little tiny braille stickers, which, by the way, are on the wrong side of the button. And you will see the number 8 does not have one of those braille stickers. And technically, those braille stickers aren't even ADA compliant because you're supposed to have the actual number in raised things too, because only about 10 or 15% of people who are blind actually read braille, so it's kind of ineffective for most communication, right? And yes, that is hydraulic fluid in the buttons. I don't know why. But that information is not available on Google Street View, and so if you're coming to an event in our space, how are you going to know what to do when you get in? It's actually harder once you get in the door than getting in the door. So what do you do if your space is like that and you have a 10-year lease, right? This is what you do. You adapt your policies, and then you effectively communicate your policy, because welcoming communication begins with policy. Okay, what do I mean by that? What you have here is a screenshot of the information that is below every GPAC event registration page. And it begins with, how can we help you fully participate? GPAC is committed to making its programs accessible to anyone. If you require an accommodation or service to fully participate, please contact, and then there's the information for our events person, at least 2 weeks prior to the event. If an accommodation would be helpful and the lead time is less than 2 weeks, please let us know so we can help. Then we say, please look at our accessibility at GPAC page. Then we have language that says that our offices and our event space are wheelchair accessible, the elevators with elevator service and accessible restrooms. GPAC also welcomes all visitors with service animals. This is very important, and this language is very deliberate. We are sending the signal on the bottom of every one of our event pages, and we have many events every month, that we welcome people with disabilities. Now, let's say you're going to say, all right, now what? What am I going to do? I'm going to check on that accessibility at GPAC page. This is a screenshot of that landing page, and it begins with, accessibility is a core value of the Greater Pittsburgh Arts Council. The beginning of the second paragraph, you will see language that says, GPAC recognizes that each person is an individual and that each individual benefits from accommodations uniquely suited to their abilities. And we welcome you to contact us. We spend a lot of time developing this language and the policy behind that language, because what we want people to do when they click on accessibility to GPAC is to see that accessibility is a value and that we actually have a policy. When you have a policy, you also have to put the resources in place for that policy. So if someone does contact me or Juan, our event person, and say, I need ASL interpretation at this event, we're like, golden. We have it in our budget, no problem. I contact the woman pictured on this page who is a 30-something woman, who is a white woman, who is an ASL interpreter, and who has a face like silly putty that can come up with any emotion you would imagine. She is also a theater artist and is an incredible theatric interpreter who also has her own following. We have images, so the images and the language say, please come. Then if you were to scroll down on that page, you'd hit this next screenshot. And what we've done is we've divided up accessibility by the type of disability of the person who would be coming. At the beginning, we have for participants with mobility disabilities. And you will see language. This is language that I wanted to point out. Smaller, old-style elevators bring visitors to GPAC's offices on the 6th floor and our event space, the big room on the 7th floor. GPAC staff are happy to provide curb-to-seat assistance navigating the downstairs door and elevators. What that does is it not only provides detailed descriptions of the hiccups in the physical accessibility of our building, but it also talks about potential solutions. Now, you're saying to me, where do I begin when I'm talking about accessibility? I say you begin with your website, because the website is the window to your organizational soul. This is where people go to learn about you, and they are looking for signals. They're looking for the signals that you get it, that you understand their issues, and you want to help. So here's what we have. This is a website, wave@webaim.org. If you were to go to this website and you click on it, what you do is you take the URL from your website, you put it in, then it runs a check. And as it runs the check, little tiny balloons are going to pop up, and you're going to click on the little balloon, and it's not going to only tell you what the problem is with your website, but how to fix it. It's extraordinarily helpful and very easy to figure out. Okay, so what are you going to look for website accessibility? We are back at a screenshot of the accessibility at GPAC page. I'm going to point out a couple of things. It is a white background with a little bit of light gray underneath it. And the writing is a very, very dark gray. Right? You need to look for sufficient contrast between the background and the text, so that people with low vision can actually read the text. For example, if you look over on the right-hand side, you'll see kind of a magenta color background that has white text. You also want to look at the ability of someone to be able to navigate through your website without using a mouse. Many people with limited manual dexterity must tab through your website. So if you can't get through your website without using a mouse, it's not accessible. In addition, you want to make sure that your website is screen reader friendly. And that means that if people who are blind access the web a lot, and they access the web through a screen reader, which literally reads out the content of your website. Now, when you and I look at a website, or if you're not blind and you're looking at a website, you gather a lot of information all at one time. A screen reader starts at the top of your page and reads downward. And it cues where to go next by the hierarchy. So when you do your website and you're looking at it, and you know they have these things like header 1, header 2, header 3 under the formatting. Many of us don't like the way they look because, you know, we're artists. We're kind of picky about that stuff. A screen reader doesn't care. It reads all the header 1s, and then it goes to all the header 2s, and then it goes to all the header 3s. And if you don't follow that hierarchy, a screen reader jumps around that page and makes it very hard for people who use them to get through. Okay. The other thing you got to do is evaluate your multimedia and social media content. Your videos must be captioned, right? YouTube, never use the YouTube auto captioning because it comes up at gobbledygook. But if you have a transcript of whatever video you're putting up, YouTube does have a tool that you upload the transcript and it syncs. Vimeo doesn't have that, and all your images should contain descriptive alt text, which actually what that does is it's a point where a screen reader picks up on it and you provide the visual information in the form of text. The next thing you want to do is look at your outreach materials. All documents should be in Word or plain text or accessible PDF. Most PDFs are just images, and that doesn't help a person with a screen reader. All materials should include the contact info for accessibility questions. Just having that info and making a person available to talk about it is crucially important. People can just reach in. They know they can have the person. You need to have a phone number and an email address. People who are deaf are going to email. People who are blind are going to call you. You also should offer accommodations at meeting, which means American Sign Language interpretation, captioning, and audio description. I want you to realize that American Sign Language is not English transliterated. It is an entirely different language. And often people who are deaf, with the big D, culturally deaf means deaf from birth, are not necessarily fluent in English, and captioning is not an effective accommodation for them. So you must listen when people ask for an accommodation as American Sign Language interpretation. Okay, most important things are your grant materials accessible? Steve, could you put the poll up, please? Okay, now, when you're talking about accessible, I would like you all to kind of answer this question so that we can figure out how people submit their grant applications. I want you, when you're considering about are your online grant materials accessible, you want to make sure that your online application is screen reader friendly. So far, we got everybody on paper. We got one person on paper, but the majority of people use an online grant platform. So is your online grant platform screen reader friendly? If you're on a screen reader, can you actually get through it? Now, the other thing I want you to think about when you come to that online grant platform is, do you have to use a mouse to get through it? If you can't tap through that online application, people with limited manual dexterity aren't going to be able to apply. And you also want to think about the time limit for each session of for people working on that application. Right? That's a big thing. People with disabilities, it takes longer. If you have to tab through it, if you have to use a screen reader, it takes a longer time to get through that application. And so oftentimes that time, when those sessions time out, it's a huge barrier, especially if you can't save it. Okay, Steve, can we go back to the slides? 90% of you are saying to us basically that you're using an online grant platform. All right? So, issues to consider. All right. I got to tell you guys, a few months ago, people started calling me and saying, hey, you want to use our online grant platform? And I asked every salesperson that contacted me, is it accessible? Many of them couldn't answer the question, is your online platform accessible? So I did some research. What you want to do really, the only one that I could find that had a really great accessibility function was SlideRoom. When you go on, what I suggest you do is when you go back to your online grant platform, I want you to go onto the page where the salespeople are, everything like that. Go all the way down to the bottom and look for that little thing that says accessibility. If it's not there, you're going to have to start emailing people. If it is there, click on it and look at the type of information they're providing. SlideRoom talks about all these issues, talks about how they've addressed them. It's actually very accessible and a very good platform. But I'm not trying to sell it. I'm just saying that's all I found so far. Now, let's say you have an inaccessible grant platform. There's always a way to get around it. And this language is included on every single one of our applications. And it is, if submitting these documents electronically is a barrier, or if you cannot submit these documents in the required form, please contact GPAC's grant team for assistance. We actually don't use an online grant platform. Everyone must submit their documents to us in Word form or as a Google Doc or as plain text, just because it's easier for all of us. So, moving on. I want you to know, is your online application accessible to all panelists? I have panelists who have vision impairments, who are blind, who have hearing loss serve on my panels. If your grant platform spits out the application as a PDF, you could be having problems and limiting not only the ability of people who submit them to read them, but also any panelists that you have to come on. Now, this is a screenshot of an old Pennsylvania Council on the Arts application. They're no longer using this platform, but this is a PDF. I had someone serve on my grant panel who was blind, and I wanted to convert the PDF to an accessible one. Every single one of those sort of like pink bubbles is a problem. what happened was that when Adobe converted this to an accessible PDF, it went from top to bottom, numbering the questions 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to 20 on the bottom, and then the answers started at 21 at the top. So as a person using a screen reader, you couldn't actually make sense of it. All right, another thing, do you include ability in your diversity statements? This, to me, is really very important. It is beyond intersectionality in many ways because it's not only does it send a strong signal, but people aren't just one thing or another. There are people of color who have disabilities. There are people with disabilities who are gay. If you don't include all aspects of identity in your diversity statements, it's sending a prescriptive or prohibitive message. My next question is, do you look at the art you fund through a disability justice lens? And I like to approach this with a little game I call Disney versus Game of Thrones. Now, the reason why on the left-hand side is a picture of the animated movie Peter Pan showing Captain Hook. Captain Hook is a pirate. He is flamboyantly dressed in a red coat with a hat and a big red hat and a big white feather plume with an evil-looking mustache. His left hand has been replaced by a metal hook. In Disney movies, often disability is shorthand for evil. Captain Hook, Scar in The Lion King, sorry, had a momentary blip there. But if you, on the right-hand side of this picture is Jaime Lannister, a character in Game of Thrones. Jaime Lannister was an incredible swords person, captain of the King's Guard, and sometimes second or third season his right sword hand was cut off and he was given a gold hand, right? The reason why I bring him up is that in Game of Thrones they have several characters with disabilities, and that disability is only one aspect of complex characters. It's not shorthand for good or bad, it's one thing. I saw that time check, Cheryl, and I'm moving on. All right, so again, here's another slide. And my question is, which would you rather be? And the left-hand side is Tyrion Lannister, played by an actor of short stature who is an extremely intelligent and complex character. On the right-hand side are the 7 dwarves. Each one of those dwarves represents one aspect of a personality. Which would you rather be? Okay, moving along. Talking about one other thing that is very important to me. 2 other images on this slide. On the left-hand side is an African-American man sitting in a wheelchair working on a computer. That is from, and I apologize for this, CSI New Orleans. And on the right-hand side is an image from the Stephen Hawking biopic with the Stephen Hawking character in a wheelchair with his daughter on his lap, and his son's off camera with it, but you can see the soccer ball he has in his hand, right? I want you to think about artists with disabilities and think about who would do a better job playing these roles. The role of a person with a disability, an actor with a disability, who is the African-American actor in CSI New Orleans, right? This man, his character does not have to be a person with a disability. He's the geeky computer guy, right? But he is an actor who actually has a disability. He was auditioned for this role and was chosen for it. Or a self-congratulatory inspiration charade, because the actor who played Stephen Hawking does not have a disability. And I want you to think about this, because when you have a role, the character of the role is a person with a disability, and is it played by a typically bodied actor. In the disability community, we call this crip face, right? Now, there are tons of talented actors with disabilities who could bring more depth, genuine knowledge, and empathy to this role, but they were not even considered for it because the people making the movie assumed they could not do it or were not good enough. I would argue that this is a result of institutional ableism. Now, on that note, I want you all to consider me a resource. I can be reached at amulgrave@pittsburghartscouncil.org. You will also find my phone number on that website, and I am happy to help you any way that I can. And now I am turning it over to Leah.
Okay, thank you so much. that provided a lot of food for thought, especially as I think about my foundation's landmark brownstone and also the way we communicate with people on our website. But let me start by saying that within the funding community, there's been a prevalent mindset where disability art grants were limited to facility improvements or programs focused on the therapeutic and educational benefits of the arts. This frame of reference has prevented disabled artists from leaving that small expected scale and reaching the big mainstream cultural institutions. But a value shift to the artistic realm is beginning, particularly in my funding area of dance, where excellence is often defined as the exclusion of disability, and where virtuosic performance involves dancers who are intensely able-bodied. Disability, however, can generate its own movement and offers unique choreographic styles. Basically, we need training in disability aesthetics to get our board, the presenters, funders, and audience to embrace disability as a positive artistic force. The first part of my presentation will highlight some good disability art resources that I have used. Then I'll highlight some recent disability art projects in New York City. I'll focus on some of the obstacles that these projects have uncovered and how the exposure of these obstacles has really primed the field with some great funding opportunities. Finally, I'm going to introduce Alice Sheppard, an artist whose work challenges conventional understandings. To start, I'd like to mention 3 resources that have been extremely helpful to me in appreciating this movement. Dance NYC has published 3 studies that I have benefited from both in funding decisions and board presentations. Performing Disability Dance Artistry, July 2018. Disability Dance Artistry, published February 2016. Discovering Disability, Data, and NYC Dance in May 2015. They've provided some excellent data and anecdotes. The most recent study, Performing Disability Dance Artistry, released in 2018, gave me some real insight about the importance of the relationship between the artist-performer and the presenter. Artists applauded presenting contacts with soft infrastructure, similar to what Anne was saying, those that provided information, collaboration, and hospitality, those who got it. Where presenting staff had an inclusionary impulse, an active intent to include disabled people rather than merely complying with the legal requirements. A second resource is Disability Arts NYC, known as DANT. It's an advocacy and watchdog organization headed by Simi Linton and Kevin Gotkin and comprised of disabled artists, academics, and activists. Now, DANT has had a significant impact in a short amount of time. It had a major influence on Create NYC, which was the cultural plan for New York City. It administered a boot camp to train new disability advocates, and it has organized several public programs about disability artistry, including one at the Whitney Museum. DANT is also on the verge of releasing another good resource. It's a white paper, tentatively called Disability Equity in New York City's Arts and Cultural Landscape, which Mertz Gilmore helped fund. The final resource is Art Beyond Sight. About 2 weeks ago, I participated in a funders workshop run by Art Beyond Sight. The goal is to create a toolkit scheduled to launch on NEA's website in early 2019. It will be an online job career resource for artists with disabilities. Here are the 3 service organizations I've worked with. They're fueling the crusade, conducting research, publishing studies, and holding forums to address the issue and advocate for action. Now I'm going to show you a few recent examples of funded projects. In 2017, the Ford Foundation made a grant to Dance NYC to create a fund, the Disability Dance Artistry Fund, which supported production costs for 6 integrated dance companies to develop and showcase performances. The fund got audiences in front of the work at important accessible dance venues, such as Ailey Citigroup Theater, Gibney, Harlem School of the Arts, New York Live Arts, and La Mama. So it created opportunities to experience the arts. Individual dance grants based on budget size were dedicated to production costs and also included audience engagement activities, some convening opportunities, and archiving. I should mention that Mertz Gilmore Foundation made 2 supplemental grants to Ford's initiative. The first was to help the 4 smallest, most financially vulnerable dance companies. It is really expensive for an integrated company in New York City, and this grant was in line with Mertz Gilmore's mission, which is to address a general inequity where most of the resources go to the bigger, more established groups. With a second grant from Mertz Gilmore, the New York Public Library for the Performing Arts was able to record several of the live performances and produce professional videos for public viewing. It's a start to the library's disability dance collection. Another initiative I'd like to highlight is Create NYC. This is the city's cultural plan, released the summer of 2017 by the Department of Cultural Affairs. When the city released Create NYC, it announced a fund of $2.2 million to make art spaces more physically accessible, to employ more individuals with disabilities as cultural workers, and to fund disabled artists and organizations representing disabled artists. Interestingly, early indications for Create NYC did not address disability art. It was the work of Disability Arts NYC, DANT, that shaped a disability focus within the plan. Now, last month, the Department of Cultural Affairs awarded $640,000 to 22 arts projects through its inaugural Create NYC Disability Forward Fund. Here are some of the organizations and the projects that received support. Alpha Workshops will formalize its paid internship program in the design field for people with disabilities. Arts Connection will work with public school students who have significant disabilities to study documentary filmmaking. The Center for Traditional Music and Dance will offer a performance-based mentoring program for Bronx veterans with disabilities, and this includes PTSD. Flux Factory will produce a major group exhibition commissioning new works by disabled artists. The Metropolitan Museum of Art will bring together scholars, educators, and artists, both with and without disabilities, to examine museum practices. And Roundabout Theater will launch a signed, interpreted subscription series for the deaf community and expand its current offerings for patrons with autism. These examples bring me to Nothing Without Us, an important tenet that Anne described. The concept of nothing without us includes efforts to correct for gaps in disability representation on boards, staff, grant review panels, and other committees, basically to ensure disabled artists are present at every stage of developing, implementing, and evaluating initiatives. A great example of Nothing Without Us was the New York Community Trust's 2017 grant to help Disability Arts NYC, DANT, organize a boot camp to train a cohort of advocates who can serve on strategic planning and other decision-making bodies. Another theme that Anne mentioned was social justice, to push that the term diversity encompasses disabled people. Because while philanthropy is making some pretty good strides in its commitment to diversity and inclusion, I think some more explicit work needs to be done to address disability. To wrap up, I'd like to mention a few of the physical and discriminatory obstacles that these projects exposed. First is the need to develop short and long-term residencies and accessible administrative space. Grow the number of disability performances and exhibits presented both in disability-specific context and where the work is presented among multiple genres. In addition, funders can invest directly in arts organizations that demonstrate an inclusionary impulse, and then share these good practices through peer-to-peer and public dialogue. Another suggestion is collaboration, strengthening partnerships between funders traditionally focused on the arts and funders focused on disability, race, and broader equity themes. Then we can grow the available resources. Harkening back to Nothing Without Us, we can create opportunities for leadership positions by artists and arts administrators with disabilities. Finally, a very important component that unfortunately Mertz Gilmore does not fund is education. The need to train and certify disabled dance educators, expand arts education opportunities for disabled children, and integrate disabled students into conservatory and university visual and performing art departments. Now the best part. I'd like to introduce Alice Sheppard, an award-winning choreographer and dancer whose other training includes disability studies, literature, and race theory. She creates movement that challenges conventional understandings of disabled and dancing bodies. As you can see, Alice recently appeared on the July cover of Dance magazine. The accompanying article described Descent, which was her performance that premiered at New York Live Arts in March of 2018. Mertz Gilmore Foundation helped to fund the outreach efforts as part of Alice's performance run of Descent. These outreach programs are great examples of the principles we've discussed so far. Alice's company, Kinetic Light, partnered with the National Disability Practitioners to offer a workshop aimed at brainstorming concrete and affordable ideas on how to transform physical facilities. Kinetic Light also partnered with several local disability organizations to ensure that members would have transportation to and from the premiere of Descent, and collected pre- and post-show data about specific ways to improve transportation. Finally, Kinetic Light partnered with Disability Arts NYC, DONT, on a post-show salon about disability aesthetics, featuring an array of artists, activists, policymakers, and cultural workers. And now, I'd love to turn it over to Alice, who can speak much more eloquently about all of this. Thank you.
Hi, I am Alice Sheppard, and I am thankful to be here. I'm a disabled dancer and choreographer, and I am proud and excited to show you a little of what we at Kinetic Light have been able to do in disability arts and culture with the support of foundations such as the Mertz Gilmore Foundation in my piece Descent. Descent is not just a dance, it's a world and ecology rooted in the aesthetics of access. And on screen is a blurry black image of me in my wheelchair diving over the edge of a ramp. The orange woodfall gleams, and the pathway behind me is lit in white light. On screen now is an image of me in my chair. I look in a nervous fashion behind me, and my crutches cross in front of me. Leah asked me to tell a little bit about my practice and how this all came about. My artistic practice is based around two large ideas in disability arts and culture, having to do with the value of disability itself and the ways in which we practice accessibility. And I'd like to just sort of hang out for a question a moment for you. Whose responsibility is access and accessibility? Where does the borderline lie between funders, presenters, and artists themselves? There are no real easy answers to this question, but I'm hoping that my work might address some of the some ways of thinking about it. First, I'd like to consider the idea that disability is a cultural force and an aesthetic. You may have been seeing these words everywhere these days. They've sort of become new buzz terms, particularly in New York City. But they are important. I think we tend to think of disability in the arts and performance worlds in two main ways. Disability is the source of inspiration for a work of art. That is, an artist creates work that has direct reference to their experiences as a disabled person, or perhaps a disabled person and their experience is the subject of the work. Disability can also be incidental. That is, the work may have been made by a disabled artist or feature a disabled artist or performer, but disability is not important to the content. We are moving into a third kind of conversation where disability is creative a cultural force, and an aesthetic. And in my work, that shows up in a number of ways. I draw from disability culture ideas about the way we live, connections with the art and work of conversations with other disabled artists, and make disability an aesthetic. And that's an interesting moment for me. I really think about disability not as something beautiful, not just as something beautiful, because it is, but disability is the set of principles and ideas that lie behind the work that I make. So that's the little part that I want to dig into for a second. Before I click to the next slide, I'd like you to think about a ramp. Just imagine an access ramp. And I'm wondering how many of you imagined a metal device that you could sling over a flight of stairs that was sort of added retroactively to a building or to a staircase in a house or within inside a building. I wanted to ask myself what happens when access becomes not just an accommodation added to a building or a set of practices that are put on a work at the end, at the time of performance or at exhibition. What happens when access becomes the content itself and a way of relating with the audience? So Steve, can you click over to the video for a second? I'm about to play a video which shows the ramp. For the first part, there are two clips. For the first part shows the ramp as a stage set, which became the set for my work Descent, covered with sculptures and projections of smoky waves riding up the ramp, bodies flowing down the peak of the ramp, and a beautiful starscape. This is what happens when access is content. In the second part of the clip, I wanted to show you some of the things that we are able to do on the ramp. Because the ramp is its own kind of structure created for art and designed for art, we were able to create movement that changed the vocabulary of dance. And so in this clip, you're going to see two dancers using wheelchairs, me and Laura Lawson, dancing on the ramp. We're going to be upside down, dragging each other, pulling ourselves across the ramp, and finally leaping towards a peak. Thanks, Steve. Can you hit it back to the other slides now? All right, thank you. So we began to really consider what would happen if you made access content. And if you made access content, we realized that access really was a way of being together. And that this is one of the principles that's coming out of disability justice communities. Access is a process, a way of relating, and a way of being together. What does that mean for an artist who is producing a work of art? What does it mean to think of the work of art as being a communication, a shared experience? We realized that to actually make dance accessible, we would have to do more than just add audio description or ASL interpretation. To actually be together in an equitable way, we start planning for access months before the show. Our relationship begins with the audience at the moment that we tell them about the show. We have a practice of accessible communication. And on screen is an image of New York Live Arts that we used in our newsletter to help orient audience members to the venue. We stay with audience members through transportation considerations. We think about financial access in our ticket pricing. We work with venues to train staff to welcome disabled people. We offer seminars for local disabled artists, and we find disabled members to work as volunteers and or staff at the venue itself. As a result, the show on stage is accessible, yes, but the whole environment is as accessible as we can make it. We have begun to think about relationship being the work, being from that first moment of reaching out. And we've learned that people feel welcomed and they come. Our most adventurous work in Access has to do with description for dance. We learn from blind audience members that description itself can be seen as a less than equitable experience. And this is a tough moment because people are just getting into thinking through description. But the difficulty is that if you are describing a dance, you are getting a displaced moment. You're not getting access to the actual artistic experience itself. So we wanted to think about how can we make dance equitably accessible. Laurel Lawson, who is a member of Kinetic Light and also for Radius Dance, both organizations funded by Mertz, Gilmore and the Ford Foundation Disability Dance Artistry Grant. Laurel coded and designed an app with an interface especially designed for people who use screen readers. And that image is on your screen as a sort of representation of a cell phone with some spots on it. Those spots each represent a different soundtrack that you can play during the show. We thought about Access living on a personal mobile device and offered to supply devices and headsets for people who did not have them. We created an accessible interface for the device for screen readers. And then we thought about what is dance? We created 7 different soundtracks rendering the dance in sound. There's poetry, a soundscape, a dramatic dialogue, traditional description, description of the projections, and there's the sounds that the dancers actually make on the ramp ourselves, from breath to heartbeat to internal perspective. The listener gets to choose how they experience descent in an artistic and visceral way. You can listen to one soundtrack, you can listen to 2 soundtracks at once, or you can DJ your own experience and listen to as many soundtracks, switching among them as you wish. We realized that this was a big moment. It meant giving up authorial control. After all, we didn't know what audience members were going to try and listen to. But we realized that that was part of the art, and are looking forward to hearing more feedback from audience members as we continue this description experiment. So that's how Access has become part of my work. It's in the content, it's in the form, it's in the aesthetics, and in the way in which I relate to my audiences. And we're just growing and deepening the practice. Thank you for listening, and stay in touch. On screen is an image of Laurel and me, both in our wheelchairs, staring at the projections in the sky, seated on the ramp, just sort of gazing into space. Thank you.
Wow, that was really great, Alice. Thank you so much. And I actually have not tried the app, but that is next on my list. To wrap up, disability access is not, whoops, there you go. To wrap up, disability access is not retroactive accommodation, but an aesthetic, as you've heard us say, integral to art making and performance. These acrylic paintings are by Jessica Park, a well-known artist with autism. Disability art is art. It is seriously intentioned creative work. It's not a hobby. It's not therapy. During my research, I read about the social model of disability, the idea that disability is actually caused by the way society is organized, rather than a person's impairment or condition. And so it's society that really has to adapt and change. This piece, The Way Ahead, by Caroline Cardis, is from the National Disability Arts Collection and Archive. The piece was a series of road signs made by Cardis. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne, Leah, and Alice. That was fantastic, and I learned so much, and I trust that everyone who's sitting on this webinar learned a lot too. I think from the resources that you offered to the examples that you illustrated and all of the personal stories, you leave us with a lot to think about. But without further ado, I'd like to move us to the Q&A. So just a reminder to all of the webinar attendees to ask your questions in the rectangular box at the bottom of your screen. And please remember to address your question to a specific presenter if that's necessary. So first question I'd like to start off with, and this is for any of you or all of you, concerning the role of language and labeling when communicating about disabled artists, is it best to use person-first language or disability-first language? So artist with a disability or disabled artist? Which one, what do you guys think about that?
Okay, so I'll take a stab at this, and then I think Alice might have something to say as well. in general, when you talk to the disability community, they request that you use person-first language, which is person with a disability. And that's designed to state that disability is not the defining characteristic of the person, but an aspect of identity. However, as I'm sure you noticed when Alice was speaking, she refers to herself as a disabled artist, and that is a choice. As with all things, sometimes it's best to ask people how they would prefer to be. The standard in the United States now is basically person with blank. However, when you are speaking with people, they'll say they want something other. Ask, listen, and respond.
Great.
Yeah, thank you, Leah. Ask, listen, respond. I use disabled artist for two reasons. It is the term that the activists, scholars, artists, and cultural researchers and workers use as the identity term. We often, organizations use person-first language to minimize social stigma around disability, to emphasize that there is a person first, not just a wheelchair. But when you're diving into the political realm and the cultural realm, you tend to find people using disability-first language, and that's the language of my choice. And I really believe in disability-first language as part of the identity practice.
Great. Leah, did you want to add to that?
Sure. I know when I first started presenting and talking and writing on this topic, I did not know which way to go, and I felt really uncomfortable about saying anything, to be very honest. It reminded me a lot also when I was delving into equity if it has to do with race. Gender was a little easier as I am a female, but from what I heard most of the artists say, they want that word disabled up front. You know how you would say pop art or other kinds of art? Well, this is disabled art, and it's not a stigma. It's kind of a creative fact.
That's a very good distinction and very helpful, and especially to hear from all of you, and given your work and how similar it is, but also how different it is in your experiences. So that's definitely helpful. Thank you. We've got a question from one of the attendees, and she asks, have you ever needed to make accommodations at meetings or events for people with severe, in parentheses, life-threatening food allergies? That group is also protected under Section 504 of ADA. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I do. Yes, that is not an unusual. That's not an unusual accommodation. It's not a typical one that you list, but when you put out information and you state that you're willing to work with people about helping them fully participate, we often get chemical sensitivities, severe food allergies, not just food preferences, but food allergies. So for example, when I'm organizing a grant panel and we provide food at all of our grant panels, I always say, please inform us of any dietary restrictions or preferences, and then we accommodate them. It is not an unusual thing, and it's actually a very important thing.
Okay, yeah. No, absolutely.
Yeah. I know that that's something that seems to me to be actually in the mainstream lexicon, especially if you're a mother with a kid. There is nowhere that doesn't highlight and bring to your attention the fact that food allergies are prevalent. So I see it just generally as something that has really come into the common language for any meeting or any other accommodation.
Thank you. So we're coming toward the end of our time, but I definitely want to ask this final question. And I'm directing this to Anne, but if you, Leah or Alice, have anything that you'd want to add as well, by all means. So the question is, we've been working on accessibility for a few months now, and people with disabilities are still not interested. Why should we continue, or do you have any suggestions for anyone who's in that situation?
All right, so this is the old field of dreams question. If you build it, will they come? What I would like to say is that for decades, People with disabilities have been problems to arts organizations before they've been patrons, and that's the same for grant-making organizations. We've been considered problems before we've been considered actual assets. And so what you have to do is you have to develop trust with the disability community, and that takes time. As an example, for years and years and years, our local Tickets for Kids organization would give tickets to plays to the School for the Deaf, and they wondered why they wouldn't take advantage of them, and that's because there was no ASL interpretation at any of the plays that they gave them tickets to. So when you start addressing the issue of accessibility and you start working toward becoming more welcoming, that doesn't mean that that people are going to be receptive and trust you. You actually have to do the same things you do whenever you're trying to build a relationship with any community, is go to them, talk to them, listen to them, and develop those relationships. You have to build trust before you can actually develop sort of engagement with the community, and that's got to come from your end first.
Another thing I would say is that there is such an absence of disabled people on the staff. I mean, if you really want to accommodate and engage disabled people, I think the organization has to have people of disability on it, and I think that's not common. That doesn't happen a lot. I mean, I'm looking at my own foundation. So to me, it starts by the foundation itself having a disabled person and then taking it from there to engage a broader audience.
Yeah, I think you make some great points, and the two big things that stood out to me are trust and then also, you know, walking the talk. So whatever practices and whatever you're putting out to be, you know, this is a good strategy, this is a good practice, this is how you include people, then practice that yourself. So I think that that was great what you mentioned. This has been awesome, but unfortunately we have come to the end of our time, and I want to thank Anne, Leah, and our special guest, Alice, for presenting today. We enjoyed having you, and you leave us with a much stronger understanding of how to create and uphold more welcoming and equitable practices in funding. Today's presentation has been recorded, and we'll be sending you a link to that file and the presentation slides within the next day or two, along with a brief survey, and we hope you'll take the time to fill it out. Your feedback is always important, and it helps us to design future webinars. And if you'd like the opportunity to flip through the slides now, we have switched over the slide controls to you. The slides will be up for the next hour or two, and you can always reach out to me, Sherilyn Seeley, if you have further questions. Thank you again for joining us, and have a wonderful day.